Welcome back, everyone. This is the State of the Nation. Russia's onslaught on Ukraine continues, and it looks like Putin will surely take the whole of Ukraine, even though talks are underway. Now, there is only one thing Mr. Putin wants initially. He tried to not to have a security threat next door. He never wanted Ukraine to become a threat militarily to Russia. But NATO did its due and screwed that up for him after they opted to consider the application by Ukraine to join NATO. So now it seems that he wants to take over the whole country and annex it to Russia. This will obviously have massive cascading political, geopolitical, economic and security effects all around the world that we need to monitor. Now, one thing we all here in Sri Lanka are concerned about is whether this crisis in Ukraine will impact the oil prices. But unfortunately, we are seeing steep changes in oil prices these days. Danidu is at the data wall tonight to give you a look as to how oil prices have been fluctuating in the past. Danidu.
Thank you, Mahieash. Something I want to take a very quick look at is how the Ukrainian crisis is affecting oil prices here in Sri Lanka. Now, this is a snapshot of the daily figures that we, the leaders, look at when it comes to looking at what the oil prices, the trends in the oil price market looks like. This is something we need to really understand. The offset is we as a country now import refined petroleum products, that is petrol and diesel, which ranges between $122 and $127. That is the kind of range that we are looking at. But something more important is what the crude oil market looks like. Now, in understanding that, we look at two very specific indicators and the OPEC price basket. Brent and WTI. WTI stands for West Texas Intermediary. Now, taking a better look at this, we notice that there is a spike, one big spike over here, and somewhere over here, which is February 25th, is where the entire intervention from Russia occurred, right? This is witnessed within even the WTI, the West, when it comes to crude oil. Similar situation when it comes to the OPEC price basket. Now, something we need to notice is this spike is not something that we are seeing for the first time. We have seen this in recession periods in history multiple times. What analysts are saying is this will be a short-lived rise, and it will come down, it will balance out in the near future, something that we are also hoping for. Over to you, Mahieash.
Indeed. Thank you very much, Danidu Tanamasan, with all his gizmos this time around. Well, joining me now for more insights is the CEO, editor of Biznomics magazine and research analyst, Sharan Ilam Peruma. Thank you very much, Sharan, for joining us. Now, we all know that Russia is a crucial gas provider to Europe, but not so much an energy provider to around Asia. So what kind of impacts would we see from this conflict in Eastern Europe towards Asia?
Well, Mahieash, first of all, thanks for having me on the show. You're absolutely right. Russia is a massive provider of gas, especially to Western Europe. Germany and Netherlands rely heavily on Russian gas. It's not quite correct that they aren't a big supplier to Asia. China is actually one of their biggest buyers. So is Japan and East Asia. And I think that's also very significant because you see the growth potential is mostly in Asia right now. That's where we will see more manufacturing increasing, more industrialization, and more consumption of gas. That said, for Sri Lanka right now, it's really hard to say what the effects will be because we don't use a lot of gas. We still focus on crude oil and coal. Certainly, elevated prices are going to be very difficult for Sri Lanka. It's going to be difficult on our external balance. But we have already seen elevated energy prices preceding the war, and I think that has already been accounted for with our projections for exports and so on. One thing I'd like to add also is that it's unlikely that any country in the world, that including the US and Russia, is going to tolerate elevated energy prices for a prolonged period of time, right? Because while that may be good for some energy companies, in the long run, it's just bad for manufacturing and industry across the world. So currently we have prices at about $100 a barrel, and if that sustains and increases, that's fundamentally destructive to the global economy, and I think it's in the interests of all parties to avoid that. Most likely Western Europe, North America and Russia have a lot of strategic reserves that they will start to flood into the market to bring prices down. And also we can't really tell at this point how long the crisis in Ukraine is going to last, because Russia has made significant gains compared to historic precedents of invasions, and Ukraine's already at the negotiating table. So in all likelihood, we might see this wrap up hopefully in the next month or so.
Indeed. Now, we know that the current economic conditions in Sri Lanka are not very much favorable. So what kind of impact do you all expect to see with regard to the Sri Lankan economy from this particular crisis?
Well, I think there's a lot of speculation right now how this will affect the Sri Lankan economy. I think it's too early to tell. First of all, I think Sri Lanka should have been prepared for this. We at eConsult Asia have been talking about business cycle economics for a long time. And what we say right now is that the world is entering the trough of a business cycle. This is a period in which you expect to see a lot of geopolitical conflict, tensions, wars. So it's unlikely that we will see in the short term any big effect on Russians buying Sri Lankan tea. Of course, the sanctions on Russia and the devaluation of the Russian ruble might pose a challenge in the long run. But for now, it's most likely that trade agreements and a Russian procurement of Sri Lankan tea for the next few months might have already been made. And Russia is also, mind you, an expert on how to navigate these sanctions, right? So Russia has its own payment system, so does China, and we've managed to have trade with Iran, even, for example, Iran, even when they had sanctions, right? So we don't necessarily need to use a dollar. We could look at using gold or some other form of exchange. Then moving on to tourism, you might remember that in the middle of the pandemic, the first batch of tourists that came to Sri Lanka were from Ukraine. So there's a lot of significance placed on Ukrainian tourists. That said, in the last month, I think January to February, early this year, Ukrainian tourists were less than 10% of all tourists that came to Sri Lanka. And looking at pre-pandemic figures, Ukraine doesn't factor in like the top 10. Russia is there in the top 10, but not in the top 5. So I think it's a bit premature to worry about Ukrainian arrivals, especially because now we're in March and then entering into April, May, we see the tourist season winding up. And as I mentioned before, we don't know how long this war will last. There is a significant likelihood that it could wrap up quickly with negotiations underway and Russia making massive gains in Ukraine. And another wildcard to factor in is that our biggest markets are actually Germany, UK, and India and China, actually the biggest ones. China has been closed so far, but there is some speculation that they might open up this year. So if the Chinese market opens up, the benefit from that is going to outweigh any potential loss of Russian tourists and Ukrainian tourists.
Indeed, makes sense. Thank you very much, Shuraim, for your time tonight right here on The State of the Nation.